In my last video on the Nordic model, I referenced potential drawbacks to things like worker board membership and unionization, but I also included worker democracy in that list of things with potential drawbacks, so I wanted to take a deeper dive into worker democracy and market socialism, specifically analyzing the effects of worker cooperatives on the macroeconomy should this form of organization be adopted more broadly or by mandate. A worker cooperative is a business that is owned and operated by the workers of that business. Market socialism is an economy which is characterized by worker ownership of the means of production, while at the same time resources and goods are distributed by market forces. It's difficult to find modern examples of broadly adopted market socialism. An example that I see a lot is agricultural production, especially in Finland. These firms essentially act as a superorganism for the purposes of input costs. However, each individual firm does not necessarily give all of their workers equal ownership in their business. However, this single example does illustrate somewhat of a deficit in analysis regarding worker cooperatives. I often see worker cooperatives being placed as a first-order solution to many of society's problems with equality and wage stagnation. However, the positive evidence for worker cooperatives is sometimes misapplied, especially when speaking about broad prescriptions for the macroeconomy. Today, I want to focus my analysis on a few main points. 1, the positives of worker cooperatives, 2, the negatives of worker cooperatives, and 3, the issue with worker cooperatives as a prescription for the broader economy. Worker cooperatives are shown to have a lot of the same benefit of worker representation on boards, and I won't go into this too much because the benefits of worker cooperatives are somewhat well accepted in the literature. To summarize some key findings of the literature, worker cooperatives generally pay higher wages compared to their traditionally owned counterparts. They also tend to be more resilient to downturns in economy as they're more likely to engage in broad cuts on individual employee wages and benefits versus actual targeted layoffs, often preferring to keep everyone on the payroll at a lower pay than keep less people on the payroll at the same pay. Like I said, these things are generally agreed upon in the select literature of cooperative firms, and there isn't a ton of nuance here. It makes sense that workers in cooperative firms make more than workers in traditionally owned firms, and it also makes sense that they are more rigid in downturns or might even be more productive per worker in general. Each worker taking home an equal share of the profit of a firm, including an equity stake in the firm equal to the individual as a percentage of the employees in the firm, is a great motivation for each individual worker because the work that they actually do is shown in the profits that they take home. I wanted to focus this video on some of the drawbacks that are brought up about worker cooperatives sporadically and some drawbacks that aren't necessarily brought up at all. However, just because most of this video is going to be about some potential drawbacks of worker cooperatives doesn't necessarily mean that I'm against them. I think worker cooperatives make a ton of sense for a ton of reasons. Really, what I'm trying to do is fill a void in the analysis of worker cooperatives and also point out potentially one of the main reasons that I would identify more as a social democrat than a democratic socialist, or I would identify more as a capitalist than a market socialist. Despite this, I feel like it's an interesting debate, and I think that it's also a very valuable one. Cooperatives do appear to have a problem with scaling. Once a firm becomes big enough, it seems that cooperatives do have a difficult time with the equity distribution of a business once too many employees are there. Diluting the equity to such a degree, the ownership becomes only marginally valuable, thus potentially diminishing the benefits of worker ownership in the first place, that each individual worker really feels the output of their labor. This is problematic for cooperatives as economies of scale exist, which make it potentially imperative to compete in the market. If worker cooperatives cannot properly take advantage of economies of scale, they'll remain perpetually vulnerable to traditionally owned firms who can actually scale more efficiently and take advantage of this property of economics. The solution to this problem of worker cooperatives having difficulties scaling is discussed in the book Mondragon and Economic Analysis. The solution they discuss is to form federations of worker cooperatives. Essentially, worker cooperatives would form republic-style democracies and would remain independent on the firm level, but would leverage their collective size in order to obtain economies of scale more easily, similar to the way the Finnish farmers organize themselves today, although not in an individual cooperative sense, but in a collective resource pooling sense. For example, say there exists a shoemaking industry in a nation where only a few traditionally owned firms dominate, and there are several small to medium-sized cooperative shoemaking companies that are struggling to gain ground. The cooperative shoemaking companies will struggle to scale with traditionally owned companies because of the relative ease in the hiring and firing of employees and the relative ease of obtaining investment capital for traditionally owned firms. These firms individually individually cannot overcome this problem and thus would struggle to obtain things like leather or fabric at a cheap price because the smaller the company, the less ability they have to buy in large quantities, thus reducing their per unit cost of shoes, making their shoes more expensive and less competitive, especially in a market like shoes where a significant number of consumers view these products as commodities. In reaction to this, the workers in these several worker cooperative shoe manufacturing companies can come together to pool their resources in order to bulk order supplies together in order to obtain lower costs, thus being able to more easily compete. The costs are collectivized, but the actual manufacturing and selling of shoes are left to the individual firms. The issue of scalability can be solved through this mechanism of cooperative federations, which is why I would never advocate intrinsically against worker cooperatives. I think government policies that would increase the incentives or ability to form worker cooperatives make sense on a voluntary basis, from subsidized loans that help worker cooperatives more easily obtain capital to start their businesses, all the way to right of first refusal laws, which would allow workers to produce matching capital to a private buyout automatically should they have the ability and desire to form a worker cooperative versus being bought out in the first place. Despite this, there's a more fundamental issue with worker cooperatives as a mandate or policy prescription which would reverberate throughout a market socialist economy, and this issue is certainly worth a more in-depth discussion that I hopefully will be able to provide today. Now, to give you a bit of a warning, this is going to be a densely boring discussion on the structure of companies, so feel free to engage the 2x speed button for this one. The premier advocate for market socialism, Dr. Richard Wolff, puts it like this: capitalism, a system that divides the economy into a minority, employers, and a huge majority, employees, and gives the minority dominance, fights against reforms, and always has. When occasionally it loses, like it lost the fight against FDR's New Deal, it then undoes the reforms afterwards, as was done to the New Deal from 1945 to the present. Capitalists retain the power position and the profits flowing into their hands, so they have the resources to block or undo reforms. That is our history over the last centuries. Lose the fight for child labor in the US? Okay, then move production to children in other countries. So it goes to make reforms secure against capitalists requires the revolution to remove the capitalists and replace them with worker cooperatives. Now, to be clear, I'm not arguing against worker cooperatives from a moral standpoint or from a worker solidarity standpoint. If you value democracy so intrinsically that you feel it would be most righteous to democratize the workplace, that is not unreasonable. My main contention with market socialism is the organization of the labor market. If there existed a system with a predominance of cooperatives, there would be a large increase in the number of people unemployed because of a large associated increase with the structural unemployment of a nation. Now, structural unemployment is unemployment in an economy that is caused because of some fundamental, obviously, structure or characterization of the economy. The reason I say this is because when every business internally requires workers to receive equal share of the business they work in, this creates an incentive for companies not to let go of employees because of significant cost of firing and layoffs, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, but there is another side to this coin, which is that if every company or the predominance of companies were worker cooperatives, the expense of hiring someone would go up significantly as well. To explain in more and even more boring detail, the ownership of a company is equity in a company. Say a cooperative is 10 employees, this would mean that each employee is entitled to 10% of the equity of a business each. This means that should one of the workers in a business quit or be let go, the company would need to pay out the equity to the employee in the form of cash, because this is an employee who owns part of the business that is being fired or let go, and therefore that employee is entitled to be compensated for their loss of ownership in that business. In this hypothetical company, let's say that the company was originally worth $100,000 as a buy-in from each of the 10 employees. That means that each employee initially provided $10,000 in order to start the business, but one of the employees is now leaving for one reason or another. Let's say that at the time of leaving, the company's profits grew substantially, which raised the value of the business to $400,000. This would mean the employee who is leaving would be entitled to a payment of $40,000 in exchange for their equity in the firm. This applies in the hiring process as well. Say this firm, now worth $400,000, needs extra help to expand. The employees might be initially hesitant to hire anyone else because now, instead of their equity being worth 1/10 of $400,000, which would be $40,000 each, it would now be worth 1/11 of $40,000, which would be worth around $36,400, a decrease in the equity value of about $3,600 each employee employee must face. That's not to mention that in this company, an employee, if they were to actually be required to purchase into a company, every employee of this company that was hired would need to come up with $36,000 in order to actually be hired. However, I think reasonably in a market socialist system, we probably wouldn't expect employees to come up with the initial starting capital every time they were hired at a business, but that only would sort of exacerbate the problem where every company would have to essentially give away part of their equity for free in exchange for just the labor of the employee and also in exchange for a wage. So there's always going to be sort of an incentive not to hire, or at the very least the barrier for hiring somebody becomes a lot higher from the company's perspective. Now the employees of this company might come together and make the decision to hire anyway because they might come to the conclusion that the new employee's labor is worth more than the initial decrease in the value of their current equity in the business. This just simply represents a structural problem or a structural sort of hurdle to overcome in the hiring process of cooperative firms or a cooperative market socialist economy. The problem that I describe is not apparent in other systems that I advocate for. A system where workers receive parity in the board of directors, meaning workers democratically elect at least 50% of the decision-making capacity of a business, seems to capture all of the same benefits of worker co-ops: higher wages, more worker solidarity, workplace democracy, and better working standards, without the associated problem with market socialism or a worker cooperative economy, principally the scalability and the cost of hiring issues that I just described. The only way that I can think to solve this from an economic perspective is to essentially get rid of the idea of ownership or equity in a business from an accounting standpoint, where each employee would simply be given a portion of the profits and they would stop being given that portion of the profits once they leave. However, this sort of fundamentally contends with the idea of market socialism in the first place, where you have actual ownership in a business and that ownership has value, that you own the means of production, and once you leave a company, you're entitled to be compensated for your labor in the form of the ownership you've had in that business. To conclude, I understand why an individual would advocate for market socialism over social democracy, and I understand why an individual would advocate for worker cooperatives over worker board membership, but from a pure economic perspective, I cannot reasonably see how worker cooperatives are distinctly advantageous over worker board membership as a policy prescription. Given the flexibility and associated worker benefits of worker board membership, it seems to win out over worker cooperatives as a macroeconomic structure. That being said, I'd absolutely love to hear what you think. Would you advocate for worker cooperatives over worker board membership in pure economic terms? And if so, how would you do so? I'd love to hear what you all think about my analysis. Thanks for watching.